Everybody's telling us what the perfect life is. You know, you need to spend so much time a day with your children to have quality time, and you need to spend so much time on physical fitness activities, and you need to spend so much time growing and going back to school or taking a class, and all of these things you need to do, you ought to do, you should do. And so they talked to all these experts and calculated how much it would take to live this ideal life that was going to make you this perfect human being. And they figured out that it would take 42 hours a day.
So there you have it. We just need 42 hours a day to achieve success in life and meet all the expectations that our society throws at us. I don't know about you, but I don't think I'm going to get there. Hey, I'm Ken Powell, host of FCCI's Pathway to Purpose podcast, and I'm thrilled to bring back this timeless message from Verla Gillmor Wallace when she spoke at an FCCI conference and reminded the audience that God's principles of success are very different than what we hear, see, and feel within our culture today. On this episode, Verla helps us unpack some false messaging like the sky's the limit and you can control your own destiny. You'll understand her ability to speak to these topics with authority as she unpacks some of her story and supplies a context where she lived life with some who truly believed they could achieve greatness without a relationship with the Creator God. Here's Verla.
What they forgot to tell you in those success seminars that we've all attended, I would suspect that if I took a poll of the room, that you have attended probably at least half a dozen. And they do a good job of distilling and conveniently packaging formulas to motivate us and jumpstart us when we feel stuck, and to give us encouragement and to give us that impetus to take it to the next level. And I'm not against them. I've attended tons of them. I can rattle off all the famous celebrities that come to our town and hold them. And in fact, corporate trainers tell us that in this era of business, that it's the business person who is the lifelong learner who is going to succeed ahead of people who just try and get by the way they've always done it, because market conditions are changing so rapidly. And so we need all the help that we can get. And so they perform a very valuable service as we're trying to continually grow and stay on top of what's important and keep our hearts motivated as well. But I do know that sometimes some of the things that they teach us are only half the story, and so I want to talk a little bit about that and challenge you to think a bit about how God might have conducted those success seminars. It's all about mentoring today when you know that you're going to a seminar to learn from somebody else. Basically what it boils down to is we want to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that somebody else made, isn't it? Well, one of my first mentors was a character who never really would call himself that, but that was what he was trying to be in my life. And I was in my 20s, and I was working as a copywriter for Marshall John Advertising. And I met a man named J. Roderick MacArthur. Now, Rod was the son of the late billionaire John D. MacArthur, who you may know because he founded Bankers Life and Casualty Company. And John D. reportedly had the first nickel he ever made, and he used to brown bag his lunch, and he was a very traditional kind of guy who did things the old-fashioned way. And Rod was just the opposite. Rod was a maverick and creative. He had a lot of business acumen, but he was a person who loved to break the rules. And he was especially interested in nurturing creativity in the marketplace because he felt like business people were boring. And I guess he must have thought that I had some combination of the creative gifts because I was a copywriter and my business interest. And so he had identified that he was going to take me aside a couple of times a year and drill into me what it took to be a success. And I wasn't the only one he did this with, but I was happy to have a chance to spend an hour with him a couple of times a year because he was a very interesting man. He was an owner of a PGA golf resort. He owned vineyards in France. He owned a building in downtown Manhattan. He owned a theater. He actually created a market in those collector plates. The Franklin Mint, makes a lot of them now. Well, he actually created an exchange that was like the New York Stock Exchange where you trade plates. It's called the Bradford Exchange, making millions of dollars because he made a market in this product. And he was an idea a minute kind of guy. And so when he would ask me out to lunch, he would drive up in his Rolls-Royce Corniche. I didn't even know what that was. And he would spirit me off to some fancy 5-star French restaurant where he would order in French, and I never knew what we were going to be getting until the food arrived. And then he would spend an hour regaling me with what it took to succeed. And it always started with money. And the idea was, he'd say, if you have money, then the whole world opens up to you. You have options. And so the important thing is to make a lot of money. And success and money are hand in hand. And he would always tell me that the first 100,000 was the hardest because of the fact that after that it was just a case of multiplication. And he was worth $100 million back at a time when that was a lot of money. And so I was a bit aghast at having lunch with this man, and I sat and listened more than I did any talking, although we did have a chance to talk about God because he found it very curious. I was a curiosity to him. He wasn't quite sure what this God business was about, but he wasn't the least bit interested in hearing about it, but just thought it was kind of intriguing that this person that he had chosen to mentor was a God person. And we lost touch over the years, but every 3 or 4 years I'd get a call from his secretary, and she'd say, well, Rod would like to have lunch and find out how you're doing. Well, several years passed by, and one day I got a phone call from his secretary, and she said, Rod has been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer, and he just wanted you to know, and he wanted you to know how much it had meant to him that you would spend some time with him over the years. And I said, oh, I have to see him. I have to talk to him about some things. And she said, no, Rod doesn't want to see anybody right now. He's in the final throes of this, and he is not doing well. He doesn't want anybody to see what he looks like. He's been all over the world looking for a cure, and of course, any of you who have been up close and personal with anyone who's had pancreatic cancer know that it's about 100% fatal. And so I wrote him a long letter, and I said, Rod, you are facing eternity, and isn't it about time to think about God? And I spelled out for him what it meant to have a personal relationship with Jesus, and urged him to really give some serious thought to it. And a few days later, I got a letter back that he had dictated to his secretary. And he said, no, there's no room for me at God's table. I've burned all those bridges a long time ago. And he said, besides, death is greatly overrated. I'm not doing it. And about a week later, he died. But the final line of his letter to me carried probably one of the most painful sentences I've ever heard from a man in that position. He said, they don't tell you about this in the success seminars. We think that success is going to give us all we want, and then somewhere along the road to this finding the life we've always wanted, it takes a different turn, and we find out that we're walking on the dark side, or something happens that changes everything. And success can suck us into its vortex, and we don't even realize it sometimes until it's too late and the die is cast, as Rod felt it was. Dateline did a special a couple of years ago on the search for the American dream. And they were talking about workaholism, and they talked about a book that was called Chained to a Desk, and they called workaholism and this burning drive for success as America's best-dressed addiction and the most unheralded family crisis in our country. And they interviewed a young couple from Topeka, Kansas, and both of them worked, and they had 2 young children, and they had parent problems they were trying to sort out as far as who was going to take care of mom and dad. And they had church responsibilities and neighborhood responsibilities. And at one point, the interviewer was talking with them about the American dream, and the young man said very pensively, just when you think you have your arms around it, the finish line moves. Have you ever felt that way? And that's how I felt sometimes when I sit in these success seminars. I feel like they're telling me it's one way, but I'm a journalist, and I know that everybody's got an angle. There's usually a spin somewhere, and my job is to sort out what's the truth and what's the spin. And I think there's 3 success principles that deserve being challenged. And we need to take a look at the spin. The first one is, the sky's the limit. The sky's the limit. And of course the implication is that limits are bad and you can't set boundaries. I remember when I was just entering the business world, W. Clement Stone had his famous line, "What the mind can conceive and believe it can achieve." Anybody remember that? Or Napoleon Hill's "Think and Grow Rich." I have a client that I've worked with for about 3 years, and they're traded on the NASDAQ. And this year, when we were doing their annual report, I wrote a great deal of their annual report copy. The theme for the annual report was a line taken out of a speech made by the CEO, and his line was, "We're only limited by the size of our goals." And that became the theme for the annual report. The sky's the limit. And actually, they were doing spectacularly. They still are. They had a return on investment over the time that they've been a publicly traded company of over 1,000% in a few short years. They have exceeded analyst expectations every quarter. They've got some bragging rights. You're only limited by the size of your goals. What that tells us is you dare not pause. You dare not wait. You dare not do anything but aim higher, shoot further, run faster, or else you're going to be considered a slacker. Fortune magazine did a cover story, in fact, called "Finished at 40." And in it, they interviewed people who had bought into the American dream, that this is how success should be defined. They were going to go for it. They had their big dreams. And then they hit their 40s or their 50s, and they had been working their 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And some of them were looking behind them at the debris left in their wake in terms of relationships, children acting out, heart disease, all kinds of stress, just a mess. And they began to push back and say, wait a minute, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to take a lateral move. I don't want to travel so much. Or I'm going to take a different job and downshift if necessary. And I want to do my job differently. And the American business world says, I don't think so. And they pushed back and would lay them off. And pretty soon people got the idea and they thought, well, I'll just leave before you do it. And there was this whole shift because of the fact that the business world decided that you're finished if you're not ready to play by our rules, which is the sky's the limit and you better be running hard for it. Craig Barnes, in his book, Yearning, Living Between How It Is and How It Ought to Be, said, our date books are crammed with stuff we've got to do. We wear them close to our side like modern six-shooters, and they make us feel secure. When setting appointments, we whip them out to show how busy we are and how powerful we are and how necessary we are. And what we're really confessing is how hard we're trying to fix our lives. And I think it was the psychologist Rollo May that said, we run fastest when we've lost our way. What they forgot to tell you is, in those success seminars, you can't do it all. The entire universe runs on the principle of limits. Every created being has a lifespan. Athletes know this. Well, some athletes know this. I heard a story about Muhammad Ali. When he was in his prime, he would get on an airplane, and you know how he used to call himself Superman? And he'd say, the stewardess would say, well, would you please buckle your seat belt, sir? And he'd say, I don't need a seat belt. I'm Superman. Superman doesn't need seat belts. And one flight attendant said, Superman doesn't need an airplane, you know. But doctors know that our bodies don't go on forever, and scientists know this. Jesus even had limits when he walked the earth. He didn't go to every town that people wanted him to go to. He didn't speak in every synagogue. He didn't heal everybody that he was asked to heal. He regularly took time away to rest and relax with friends like Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And he would hang out with the disciples. They'd go fishing. And he spent a lot of time alone with his Heavenly Father, getting his marching orders, making sure his values and his priorities were aligned with his Heavenly Father, so that he was not driven by circumstances, but by what he was called to do. Peter Drucker says, however, that today's executives and business owners have shockingly little understanding of what their limitations are. They don't know what they can and can't do. They think they can do it all because the sky's the limit, we've been told. They don't know their blind spots. They don't know what they can endure and what they can't, and where they should stop and what they should say no to. You know, if you don't have limits, and if you don't know your limits, you will continually be at the mercy of every outside force. You will be letting other people dictate the story of your life, and you'll be afraid to disappoint people, afraid of not meeting someone's expectations, fearful about being misunderstood if you make a certain decision that's unpopular, worried that you'll be seen as not a player, not a hard worker, too old or not smart enough. Because, as they say in executive coaching circles, you're looking for yourself where you're not, which is out there. That's not where you are. You're in here. You see, God's success principle is a little different than the sky's the limit. His principle is focus. Learn what it is you're here to do. Let your life purpose be your guide as to what you say yes and no to, and stick to it. Because everything out there is like a beast saying, feed me, I want more of you. People never walk up to you and say, you know, you're working entirely too hard. I wish you'd just lay down some of those projects. That deadline, don't worry about it. Nobody ever has said that to me. It's up to us to take responsibility for all of those forces. Because you see, I believe that God will hold us accountable for what we were supposed to do but didn't because we were so busy taking on things that he never asked us to do. Now, focus means that we're going to need to prioritize and pare down. Paring down, of course, means doing fewer things, and prioritizing means doing the right thing. Paring down can look a lot of different ways. It might be paring down financial pressures. You heard David talk about some of the startling statistics about the indebtedness of most people in our country. I have a client who is a national subprime lender working with car dealers to provide loans for people who don't have great credit. Now, the traditional demographic of a subprime borrower has been that they're people who are blue collar, or they're day laborers, or they're people who just, not too smart, not enough education. And they have a proprietary tool that gives them some demographics on their customers, and it's very startling. There is a huge percentage of subprime borrowers who make well into six figures. It's like a best-kept secret, because people who make a lot of money have trouble sorting out their wants from their needs. And so maybe paring down means getting a handle on financial pressures by sorting out your wants from your needs. It might mean getting a handle on emotional pressures, like trying to prove something to that parent that told you you'd never add up to anything, and it drives you. Not being sure you measure up in some area. Maybe you came along when your parents couldn't afford to send you to college, and you've always had a complex about that. And so you worked 3 times harder to compensate for it. But that's emotional junk. That's not something that God is asking you to do. And so in addition to financial pressures or emotional pressures, you might need to pare down time pressures. Just plain old learning to say no. USA Today did a survey about 3 years ago, and they decided that everybody's telling us what the perfect life is. You need to spend so much time a day with your children to have quality time, and you need to spend so much time on physical fitness activities, and you need to spend so much time growing and going back to school or taking a class, and all of these things you need to do, you ought to do, you should do. And so they talked to all these experts and calculated how much it would take to live this ideal life that was going to make you this perfect human being. And they figured out that it would take 42 hours a day. So is it no wonder that we feel like that we can't measure up? Because it's impossible to do what everybody thinks we ought to do. And so we've got to stop listening to the people who are telling us what we ought to do and start focusing on what God says he's called us to do. And that means prioritizing once you get those things down pat that you're going to be doing, you're paring down, prioritizing what's left so you know what to do when. You know, remember that story in the Bible with Mary and Martha? And I identify with Martha because I'm a Martha. And Jesus was over at their house for dinner, and Martha was out in the kitchen, cooking this gourmet meal, kind of the Martha Stewart wannabe, and she wanted to show off to Jesus, and honor him with a nice meal. And Mary's in the living room sitting at Jesus' feet and listening. And Martha comes out of the kitchen, and she's really ticked off. And she says, "Excuse me, but I'm in the kitchen sweating. Mary's sitting here loafing. Do you think maybe, Jesus, you could ask my sister to come into the kitchen, give me a hand, and we can get this meal on the table, and then we can all enjoy you?" And what did Jesus tell her? Every time I read it, I just get ticked off. Jesus says, "Martha, Martha, you're worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better." Do you know what your one thing is? What your few things are? Pare down and prioritize, because if you listen to the world, they'll be telling you the sky's the limit. And we all have limits. The second success principle that I think we need to challenge is this: control your own destiny. How many times have you heard that? You can control your own destiny. It threatens us to the very core of our being to think that we might be subject to the same laws of nature as the dead dog beside the road, right? I want to think I don't have to suffer the way everybody else suffers with not being able to be in charge. The implication, of course, is that control is possible and that it's necessary for our happiness. And I have to say as an aside, have you noticed how this week all the speakers have talked about control? None of us talk to each other. And that's a sign that God is saying, hello, hello, anybody listening? Hello. This is something that's especially important. We tend to think that if we work hard enough, and if we get into the right neighborhood, and we can drive the right car, and we get our kids into the right school, and we marry the right spouse, and we get down to the right size, that all of a sudden, when everything is just about right, we can say, nobody move, and freeze frame that perfect life and just coast the rest of the way. Doesn't that sound appealing to you once in a while when life is knocking you upside the head? But what they forgot to tell you when they tell you that you can control your own destiny is that that's a myth. You can't make life behave. Because just when you think you got everything exactly how you wanted it, something comes along and totally upends your well-made plans. Happens every time. We have a feature on our lifechasers.org website that is called From the Trenches. And we interview CEOs and senior executives talking about some of the issues that they struggle with. And we talk about real-life situations. Times when somebody was trying to bid against some bidders that were bidding unethically. Or when somebody had to fire somebody that everybody in the company loved. And how do you handle those situations? And they tell their stories. And one of the men that I talked to was a man our CEO co-owns a $750 million information technology company in St. Louis. And he was telling me about the story of their company's history. They started off with a bang, and they were going great guns when the IT explosion hit, and they were really riding high, and things were moving so fast he just couldn't keep tabs on everything as closely as he wanted. So what he did was he surrounded himself with people that he knew and trusted, people that he'd known for years, that he thought, okay, my senior team is going to be people that I can depend on, because it's just moving too fast. I mean, it's like drinking from a fire hose here. I need to know that I can keep running the race here. And one day he was sitting in his office, and they came and repossessed his luxury car. as he was looking out the window, he saw them coming and driving it away. And he was shocked because the company was making a lot of money, he thought. And it happened right in front of all of his employees, and he was humiliated because he had told everybody about his faith and had witnessed to people and had been trying to do the company in a godly way, and it was horribly embarrassing. And as he began to do some digging, he learned that one of his most trusted advisors, who was in charge of finances, had been cooking the books. And he found out that he couldn't make life behave. And he had a very embarrassing moment. In my home church, I go to a mega church outside of Chicago in the suburbs, and I don't know if you've read in the Wall Street Journal, but Chicago has been one of the hardest hit cities in the recession as far as job losses and cutbacks and so on. And it's been especially tough in our corner of the Chicago metropolitan area because there are a whole lot of Fortune 500 headquartered companies there. You know, Sears and Allstate and Kraft and Baxter and Seaman Pharmaceutical and Sears, did I say Sears? And so a lot of those people go to our church. And we have an attendance that runs over 4 or 5 services of 18 to 20,000 people. But our pastors did a survey and learned that we have 1,000 to 2,000 people in our church who in the last year have lost their jobs. Just in our church. And these were smart, talented, many senior level people. One of the gentlemen that sat at my table at ExecuServe, which is one of our ministry to senior executives, had just been laid off from Motorola after 29 years in the senior level at Motorola. Because you can't always make life behave. But it's no wonder we want to be in charge. I mean, who wants to be the whipping? Obviously, we want to try and control. That's what we've talked about over and over this week. But what's the fruit of it? That's what I keep coming back to. You know, what kind of fruit does that bear? I think the 2 most obvious kinds of fruit are exhaustion, because it wears you out to play God's role when you're not God, and disappointment because control can't deliver what it promised. It can't guarantee you won't ever have a surprise. It can't promise you that you won't ever get hurt. It can't protect you against heartache, devastation. So what if putting God in charge was another way to live, and it would be your best shot at getting more control than you have right now? Now, I'm not talking about making God your consultant. That's how a lot of us see him. And I'm a consultant, and you know how people view consultants. You bring them in, you ask their advice, you pay them, and then you decide, I'll take this piece, I don't like this piece, this is good, this is not good, this doesn't work for me, this works for me. And I think sometimes I do. I treat God like that. I like, that's a good plan, God, about this, but, you know, this issue, it doesn't work for me. And God's not interested in being our consultant. He'll start that way if that's where you're at, but he really longs to be our chief executive. That means you may have to be reporting to somebody for a change instead of being the boss. Because God's success principle is to transfer control, to not try and control your own destiny, but to transfer control to him. Let him be your successor CEO. He isn't subject to changing market conditions. He never gets sick, and he doesn't have health crises, and he isn't a person who has character defects, and he never gets downsized, and the board doesn't ever get rid of him. But here's the catch. Only one person gets to be God, and only one person gets to be CEO. There's no co-CEOs. Now, every once in a while, you'll read about a company that tries to do the co-CEO route, and it always turns out badly. I actually worked for an $800 million healthcare conglomerate as an executive, and we were about to merge with a $1 billion other healthcare conglomerate, and the new entity was going to be this brave new world of healthcare. And everything was going along swimmingly. There was lots of synergy until the CEOs had to decide who was going to be the last man standing when the merger took place. And it almost threatened to sabotage the merger because there were all these warring factions about who would be the controlling management team, when this new entity came into being. And so they hit upon the idea of co-CEOs, which they did for 1 year. It was not pretty. It was not pretty. Because God says, you want me to be in charge, I get to be in charge. Who does he think he is? He's not Mr. Rogers. He's not tame. He won't settle down. He won't hesitate to disturb your comfort zones. He won't hesitate to challenge all of your assumptions. He might interrupt your plans. He might even keep you on a need-to-know basis. Who does he think he is, God? Yeah.
Who does he think he is? God? Yes. Well, we'll hear the rest of this message from Verla in the coming weeks as she reminds us that God has the right to change the plans and disrupt our lives. It's our calling to be so in tune with his leading that we're ready to follow and trust him no matter where he takes us in life and in business. And as we look forward to this year's international conference in September, it's the biblical leadership mindset that Verla is describing that is the context of our conference theme of advancing the gospel through business. In fact, it's the core foundational worldview and vision of FCCI, transforming the world through Christ, one company leader at a time. You can learn more about upcoming regional events, leadership groups, and the international conference at fcci.org. Thanks for listening, and may God encourage your journey as you lead a company for Christ.